Picture this: June 1944, Normandy beaches. British troops are charging into one of history's most brutal battles. And guess what they're carrying? A rifle designed in 1895. That's right, nearly half a century old. The short magazine Lee-Enfield, officially adopted back in 1907, was still the weapon of choice for every Commonwealth soldier hitting those beaches. Now, their German enemies? They had the Karabiner 98K, a sleek evolution of the famous Mauser action that had been refined to near perfection over decades. Here's where it gets interesting. On paper, the British should have been outgunned. The German rifle was more accurate over distance, built with modern materials, and many experts considered it the absolute peak of bolt-action engineering. Yet something bizarre kept happening on the battlefield. British soldiers would capture these supposedly superior German rifles, take one look, and toss them aside. They kept their Lee-Enfields. This wasn't about being sentimental or stubborn. This was about survival. Let's rewind to the 1880s. The British military knew they needed a repeating rifle that could handle the new smokeless powder. Enter James Paris Lee, a Scottish-Canadian inventor who'd created something revolutionary: a detachable box magazine system. The British Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield added their own rifling design. And boom, the magazine Lee-Enfield was born. It first saw action in the Second Boer War. By 1907, after some tweaks and improvements, they perfected it into the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III, the legendary SMLE. This rifle would fight through 2 world wars and countless other conflicts. But here's the thing. It wasn't any single feature that made it legendary. It was how all the practical pieces came together for actual combat. Back then, military thinking was obsessed with long-range shooting. European armies wanted rifles that could hit targets at 800, 1,000, even 2,500 yards. The Germans especially prided themselves on marksmanship, and their Mauser rifles showed it. Longer barrels, tighter manufacturing standards, the works. The British? They went a completely different direction with the SMLE. They shortened the barrel to just 25.2 inches, making it way easier to handle in trenches and vehicles. Sure, they sacrificed some long-range accuracy, but their combat research showed most firefights happened within 300 yards. European military experts thought this was crazy. Then World War I proved the British right, when trench warfare became reality after 1914. The rifle's rear-locking bolt design made firearms experts raise their eyebrows. Most military rifles, including the Mauser, locked at the front, where lugs near the chamber handled the firing pressure. The Lee-Enfield's lugs sat at the back of the bolt, which theoretically made it weaker and less precise. Critics said it would never match a Mauser's accuracy. And you know what? They were absolutely right. On a shooting range. But battlefields aren't shooting ranges. The Lee-Enfield's design brought advantages that mattered way more than shaving inches off target groups at 600 yards. That longer bolt travel from the rear-locking system? It made the rifle cycle faster. Plus, the action handled dirt and gunk better. Fast forward to 1939. Britain's at war with Germany again, and the SMLE is technically outdated. So what did they do? They ramped up production instead of replacing it. Factories across Britain, India, and Australia pumped out millions more. British commanders weren't stuck in the past. They understood something that engineering manuals didn't always show. What works on paper doesn't always work in combat. The British Army had this training requirement that sounded absolutely insane to new recruits. Every soldier was expected to fire 15 aimed rounds per minute from their bolt-action Lee-Enfield. The really skilled ones could push that to 30 rounds. They called it the Mad Minute. And this wasn't some peacetime show-off drill. This was fundamental combat doctrine that would literally save the British Expeditionary Force in World War I's opening months, August 23, 1914. The Burma, Belgian town of Mons, roughly 70,000. British soldiers faced nearly 160,000 German troops. The Germans expected an easy victory against what looked like a small, outdated force. Instead, they hit a wall of rifle fire so intense that German commanders genuinely believed they were facing hidden machine guns. They weren't. They were facing British riflemen doing exactly what they'd trained. For the SMLE's action was built for speed. The bolt handle sat at 60 degrees instead of the usual 90 degrees found on most military rifles. That shorter throw meant less movement between shots. Your hands stayed in their natural position without awkward wrist twisting. The rifle cocked the firing pin when you closed the bolt rather than when opening it, which felt more natural during rapid fire. When you opened the bolt, the spent shell ejected smoothly without fighting against a compressed mainspring. You could focus entirely on chambering the next round. Combined with relentless training, this system turned individual soldiers into devastating firing platforms. British rifle training was arguably the world's most intensive. Recruits spent weeks on rifle ranges before learning anything else about combat. They practiced firing from every position imaginable: standing, kneeling, sitting, prone. They drilled magazine changes until they could swap a fresh 10-round magazine in under 3 seconds. They trained their eyes to judge range and adjust sights accordingly. The SMLE's ladder sight system looked old-fashioned compared to German designs, but it was actually faster to adjust under pressure. You flipped a lever, slid the sight to your range marking, locked it down. No fine-tuning, no overthinking, just combat practical speed. The Mad Minute qualification meant hitting a 12-inch target at 300 yards 15 times in 60 seconds. That included loading a fresh magazine mid-drill while staying accurate. Soldiers who managed 20 hits earned marksman status. A legendary instructor, Sergeant Snoxall, reportedly achieved 38 hits in 1 minute during a 1914 demonstration, though he had an assistant feeding him loaded magazines. The point wasn't breaking records. It was drilling muscle memory so deep that rapid, accurate fire became automatic under stress and chaos. At Mons, German troops advancing in formation got cut down at ranges where they couldn't even fire back effectively. After-action reports describe entire German companies being stopped cold by what they truly believed was sustained machine gun fire from multiple positions. In reality, sections of 8 to 10 British riflemen were producing that volume of fire. A captured German lieutenant later told interrogators he'd counted the rate of fire and estimated his unit faced at least 20 machine guns. He couldn't wrap his head around bolt-action rifles generating that kind of firepower. The British had just 4 machine guns per battalion at Mons. Everything else was rifles, training, and the SMLE's rapid-fire capability doing exactly what it was designed for. Trench warfare was a nightmare for gun designers. Everything that looked elegant in factory testing became a liability in the reality of the Western Front. Rifles sat exposed to rain, snow, and the infamous Flanders mud, a clay-heavy soup that worked into every crack. Soldiers couldn't maintain weapons like peacetime manuals suggested. No heated armory, no clean workspace, no proper cleaning supplies. You shook off what moisture you could, maybe used a rag if lucky, and worked with whatever oil hadn't run out weeks ago. In these conditions, the Lee-Enfield thrived while more advanced rifles failed. The secret was its looseness. British manufacturing tolerances were deliberately less precise than German standards. Parts had more play, more clearance between moving surfaces. To precision-minded engineers, this looked like sloppy craftsmanship. To soldiers in trenches, it meant the difference between a working rifle and an expensive club. When mud or ice got into the action, the Lee-Enfield's generous clearances let it keep cycling. Sure, the bolt might feel gritty and rough, but it still moved. The Mauser 98K with its tighter tolerances and front-locking lugs, positioned right where debris collected near the chamber, It would bind and jam. German soldiers found themselves frantically clearing their actions while British troops kept shooting. The cock-on closing mechanism provided another survival advantage. Because the mainspring only compressed when closing the bolt, opening it required less force. If your action started binding from dirt or rust, you could still muscle the bolt open to clear jams or eject stuck cases. The Mauser's cock-on opening design meant you fought mainspring pressure while simultaneously trying to break loose fouled lugs. In freezing conditions, when metal contracted and moisture turned to ice, this difference became critical. British troops in winter 1917 reported their rifles still functioning when German prisoners' weapons had frozen solid. The prisoners hadn't been careless with maintenance. They simply had less forgiving machines. Water resistance wasn't accidental. The SMLE's magazine design featured a cutoff, letting you use the rifle single shot while keeping your magazine in reserve. More importantly, the magazine well had drainage. Water that got inside could flow out, rather than pooling around cartridges causing corrosion or feeding problems. The Mauser's internal magazine, fed from stripper clips, had no such drainage. Water entering the action stayed there, mixing with gun oil and powder residue to form corrosive paste. British armorers salvaging German weapons after major offensives. Noted captured Mausers often had rust and corrosion in the magazine well, even when external metal looked fine. The rifle's wood furniture contributed to reliability in counterintuitive ways. The SMLE's stock was made from walnut, usually Indian walnut, which was relatively soft and absorbed impact without cracking. When soldiers used rifles as hammering, tools to drive trench stakes, open ammunition crates, or break ice, the Lee-Enfield stock survived abuse that would shatter the harder beechwood commonly used in Mauser stocks. A cracked stock wasn't just cosmetic. It affected accuracy and could make the rifle dangerous to fire if severe enough. British ordnance reports from the Somme offensive noted Lee-Enfields returned for repair had far fewer catastrophic stock failures than captured German rifles subjected to similar abuse. The Mauser 98 action is often called the most successful bolt-action rifle design in history, and for good reason. Paul Mauser's 1898 design became the template dozens of countries copied or adapted. Its controlled feed extractor gripped the cartridge rim as soon as the round left the magazine, guiding it smoothly into the chamber. The dual front locking lugs positioned right at the chamber gave maximum support, exactly where pressures peaked during firing. The three-position safety allowed the bolt to be opened with safety engaged for unloading. On paper and on the range, the Mauser represented the pinnacle of bolt-action engineering. German soldiers trained as marksmen, and their weapon reflected that emphasis on precision. At 600 yards, a skilled German rifleman with a K98K would consistently outshoot a British soldier with an SMLE. But wars aren't won at 600 yards on known distance ranges. The Mauser's strength was also its limitation. Those tight tolerances guaranteeing precision made the action less forgiving. The controlled feed system, while theoretically superior for reliability, required the bolt to travel through a longer, more complex path. You had to lift the bolt handle a full 90 degrees, pull straight back for considerable distance, push the new round forward while ensuring it engaged the extractor properly, then rotate the handle back down. Each movement had to be deliberate and complete. Rush it, and you'd get failures to feed or double feeds. Under stress, when hands were cold or shaking, when you needed rounds downrange immediately, that complexity became a handicap. German military doctrine emphasized deliberate aimed fire. Their training manuals stressed breath control, trigger squeeze, proper sight picture. German soldiers were expected to make every shot count, particularly at longer ranges where the Mauser's superior accuracy showed. This philosophy made sense. For late 19th century warfare, when engagements happened at longer distances and ammunition supply was constantly concerning. But by 1914, and certainly by 1939, infantry combat had changed. Automatic weapons provided sustained fire. Artillery dominated battlefields. The infantryman's role increasingly involved rapid response at closer ranges, exactly where the SMLE's advantages emerged. The practical difference showed in rate of fire. A trained German soldier could fire approximately 10 to 12 aimed rounds per minute with the K98K. Respectable, better than most armies equipped with similar rifles, but half the SMLE's standard. In a 2-minute firefight, a British soldier could put 30 rounds down range, while his German counterpart managed 24 at best. Those extra 6 rounds represented potential casualties inflicted or suppression fire keeping enemy heads down. Multiply that across a platoon and the difference became decisive. German small unit tactics had to rely more heavily on their excellent MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns to provide volume of fire that British sections could generate with rifles alone. The Mauser's longer barrel, 23.6 inches, compared to the SMLE's 25.2 inches, gave it superior muzzle velocity and flatter trajectory at range. German snipers loved the K98K for this reason. But for average infantrymen, that extra accuracy potential was wasted. Combat studies from both world wars consistently showed most soldiers couldn't effectively use their weapons' maximum accurate range under battlefield stress. The noise, confusion, fear, and physical exhaustion of combat degraded marksmanship far more than any inherent accuracy limitation. The SMLE was accurate enough for ranges where fighting actually happened, and its faster operation mattered more than precision most soldiers couldn't achieve anyway. Magazine capacity seems like a minor detail until you're in a firefight counting rounds. The Lee-Enfield held 10 rounds in a detachable box magazine. The Mauser K98K held 5 rounds in an internal magazine fed from stripper clips. That 2-to-1 advantage fundamentally changed how soldiers fought. When a British section opened fire, they could sustain it twice as long before reloading. When they did reload, swapping magazines took roughly 3 seconds with practiced motion. Drop the empty, insert fresh one, chamber a round. A German soldier reloading his Mauser had to open the bolt, position a 5-round stripper clip in the guide, push cartridges down with thumb pressure until they fed into the magazine, extract the empty clip, then chamber the first round. Even well-trained soldiers needed 6 to 8 seconds, and that's assuming the clip fed smoothly without jamming. The math of small unit combat made this capacity difference multiply across engagements. A standard British infantry section of 10 men in sustained firefight with all rifles firing could deliver 100 rounds before anyone needed to reload. A comparable German squad of 10 men could deliver 50 rounds. If the engagement lasted 2 minutes and both sides maintained trained rates of fire, the British section put roughly 300 rounds downrange, while the German squad managed around 200 to 240. This wasn't just about ammunition expenditure, it was about maintaining continuous fire. While German soldiers reloaded, British soldiers kept shooting. That sustained pressure kept enemies suppressed, prevented maneuvering, and created opportunities for flanking or advancing. The detachable magazine system gave British soldiers tactical flexibility internal magazines couldn't match. You could carry loaded magazines in pouches on your webbing, ready for instant use. Standard British battle order included 2 pouches, holding 5 10-round magazines each, 50 rounds in easily accessible magazines, plus another 50 loose rounds in bandoliers for refilling during lulls. This meant soldiers could fire 50 aimed rounds in under 4 minutes without fumbling with loose cartridges. German soldiers carried ammunition in pouches designed for stripper clips, efficient for the Mauser's design, but meaning every reload required manipulating small metal clips under stress. Drop a clip in mud or grass, and those 5 rounds became difficult to recover and use. The magazine cutoff feature added another practical layer. By engaging the cutoff, you converted the SMLE into a single-shot rifle while keeping your magazine fully loaded in reserve. This made sense when ammunition conservation mattered, but you might suddenly need rapid fire. You could pick off targets individually, feeding single rounds through the action, then instantly release the cutoff, and have 10 rounds available if the situation escalated. The Mauser had no equivalent feature. You either used your magazine or loaded single rounds, but couldn't seamlessly transition between modes. Reloading under pressure revealed another advantage. The SMLE's magazine well was generously sized and beveled. Even in darkness or when exhausted and shaking, you could guide a magazine into place by feel. The magazine catch positioned where your trigger finger naturally reached when shifting grip for reloading. One press, empty magazine dropped free. Insert, push until you heard the click. Back in action. The Mauser's internal magazine meant nothing to drop or insert, which sounds advantageous until you realize that also meant no quick reload option. Once your 5 rounds were gone, you had to feed the rifle slowly, cartridge by cartridge, or clip by clip. German soldiers envied the British magazine system even while taking pride in their rifles' other qualities. Private Harold Bolton of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment wrote home in October 1914 describing a curious incident after the First Battle of Ypres. His section overran a German position and found several abandoned Mauser rifles in excellent condition. The men examined them with professional interest. These were, after all, weapons German propaganda claimed were superior to anything the British carried. Bolton's sergeant, a career soldier with 12 years' service, worked the Mauser's action, sighted down the barrel, and handed it back with a simple comment. "Fine weapon for a Sunday shoot. I'll keep me Lee-Enfield for killing Germans. Thanks." The captured rifles went to headquarters. Every man in that section kept his SMLE. This pattern repeated throughout both world wars. After major engagements, British and Commonwealth troops had opportunities to acquire German weapons. Some kept them as souvenirs. Some used captured ammunition when supplies ran low. But given genuine choice, soldiers overwhelmingly preferred their Lee-Enfields. Corporal Jack Thomas, who fought in North Africa with the 8th Army, kept a diary that survived the war. In a January 1943 entry after fighting around the Mareth Line, he described his platoon stripping a German supply dump. They took ammunition, food, even a few MP-40 submachine guns, but captured K98K rifles were left behind. Thomas wrote, "The lads won't trade their rifles. Jerry's looks smart, but ours shoots faster. And that's what counts when they're running at you." Lieutenant William Douglas Home, who served with the Royal Armoured Corps, recorded observations in later published letters. After interrogating German prisoners in Normandy during July 1944, he noted their respect for British marksmanship and rate of fire. One German sergeant told him through a translator his squad had been convinced they faced automatic weapons during an engagement near Caen. When Douglas Home explained it was bolt-action rifles, the sergeant didn't believe him initially. He'd counted incoming fire and insisted no bolt-action rifle could sustain that volume. Douglas Home brought out an SMLE and demonstrated the Mad Minute technique. The sergeant's expression, Douglas Home wrote, was a mixture of respect and profound annoyance at being beaten by what he'd considered obsolete equipment. The perspectives weren't purely British. Indian Army troops, who made up substantial portions of Commonwealth forces, were equally devoted to the rifle they called 303 after its caliber. Sepoy Jivan Singh of the 4th Indian Division wrote in Punjabi to his family describing the East African campaign against Italian forces. In 1941, his unit captured Italian Carcano, rifles and German Mausers being used by colonial troops. Singh described trying a Mauser and finding it too slow for battle, good only for careful shooting. The Indian Army had used Lee-Enfields since 1905, and soldiers from the northwest frontier to Burma consistently praised its reliability and speed. Indian troops fought in some of the war's harshest conditions: desert heat, monsoon humidity, mountain cold, and their testimonies repeatedly emphasized the SMLE functioned when other rifles failed. Australian soldiers were notoriously pragmatic about equipment. If something worked better, they used it regardless of regulations. Sergeant Bill Griffiths, who fought at Tobruk and El Alamein with the 9th Australian Division, kept notes forming the basis of a post-war memoir. He described captured German equipment being constantly evaluated. Australian troops happily adopted German stick grenades, which they found superior to British Mills bombs for certain tasks. They scavenged German optics and machine guns. But Griffiths noted that in all his time in North Africa and later the Pacific, he never saw an Australian soldier voluntarily replace his Lee-Enfield with a captured rifle. The attitude, he wrote, was simple. The bloody thing works. Shoots straight enough and shoots fast. Why would you change? The North African desert tested weapons in ways European battlefields never could. Sand worked into every mechanism with water's persistence. Temperature swings from freezing nights to 120-degree days expanded and contracted metal parts. Moisture from coastal regions combined with sand to create abrasive paste that could wear down moving parts in weeks. British forces fighting across Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia from 1940 to 1943 found the SMLE handled these conditions better than virtually any other rifle in theater. German troops respected the Mauser's precision, but their field manuals included extensive desert maintenance sections, special procedures required to keep the K98K functioning. British manuals simply said, "Shake out the sand and keep firing." The loose tolerances engineers criticized became salvation in the desert. Sand that would jam a Mauser's tighter actions simply fell through the Lee-Enfield's more generous clearances. Australian and New Zealand troops at Tobruk fought through sandstorms, reducing visibility to arm's length. When sand cleared, their rifles still worked. Italian Carcano rifles used by opposing forces frequently seized completely after sandstorms, requiring full disassembly. Even the Mauser needed significant cleaning before reliable function returned. British armorers' reports from the Tobruk siege noted Lee-Enfields came back for repair, with sand literally caked inside the action, yet most still functioned well enough for combat. 1 August 1941, report documented a rifle that had fired over 200 rounds during a 3-day engagement, without cleaning, and was still operational when finally inspected. Burma and the Pacific Theater brought opposite. Extremes, torrential monsoon rains, jungle humidity keeping metal perpetually damp, and mud making Flanders look dry by comparison. The British 14th Army fighting in Burma from 1942 to 1945 operated in conditions where metal rusted overnight and wooden stocks swelled from moisture absorption. Japanese Arisaka rifles, well-designed weapons in their own right, suffered from humidity affecting their chrome-lined bores and causing feeding issues. The SMLE's unlined bore required more frequent cleaning, but proved less prone to pitting and corrosion plaguing chrome barrels when plating failed. The walnut stocks absorbed moisture without the dramatic swelling, affecting denser woods used in Japanese and some German rifles. British troops operating in the Arakan and along the Chindwin River often went weeks without proper weapon maintenance facilities. Sergeant Charles Carfrae of the Border Regiment described his rifle after 3 weeks of continuous jungle operations in early 1944. The metal was spotted with surface rust. The stock had turned nearly black from moisture and handling. The barrel was fouled from hundreds of rounds without proper cleaning. Yet when his unit engaged Japanese positions at the Nagakyadok Pass, the rifle functioned perfectly. Carfrae wrote he'd seen captured Japanese Rifles in far better cosmetic condition that wouldn't cycle reliably because moisture had affected their tighter actions and caused feeding problems. The Arctic presented yet another test. British and Canadian forces operating in Norway in 1940 and later Allied troops in Northern Europe during winter 1944–45 faced temperatures dropping below 0 Fahrenheit. Lubricants thickened into gel. Metal contracted. Moisture froze instantly. The German solution was using minimal lubrication and special cold-weather oils. But this required specific supplies not always available to frontline troops. The British solution was simpler. Remove all oil from the Lee-Enfield's action and run it dry. The rifle's design allowed it to function without lubrication in extreme cold. Canadian troops fighting in the Scheldt estuary during November 1944 reported their Lee-Enfields functioning reliably in sleet and freezing rain that left German prisoners' rifles frozen and inoperable. The cock-on closing action meant less force required to open the bolt, which mattered when metal contracted from cold, and every movement required extra effort. The Lee-Enfield's service life tells a story contradicting conventional wisdom about military technology. The rifle entered British service in 1895 as the magazine Lee-Enfield, evolved into the SMLE in 1907, and remained the standard British and Commonwealth infantry weapon through World War II. But its story didn't end in 1945. India continued manufacturing Lee-Enfields until the 1980s. The rifle saw combat in Korea, Malaya, Kenya, Suez, and the Falklands. Canadian Rangers in the Arctic were still issued the No. 4 Memke-Wine variant until 2015, 120 years after the Lee-Enfield design first appeared. No other military bolt-action rifle approaches this service record. The Mauser 98K, despite its technical excellence, was replaced within years of Germany's defeat. The American Springfield 1903, the Japanese Arisaka, the Soviet Mosin Nagant, all were phased out within a generation of World War II's end. Only the Lee-Enfield persisted. This longevity wasn't nostalgia or bureaucratic inertia. It was recognition that the rifle got the fundamentals right in ways that mattered more than specifications. Suggested the British hadn't set out to build the most accurate rifle or most precisely manufactured rifle. They'd built a rifle optimized for what infantry combat actually required: sustained rapid fire, reliability under adverse conditions, and simplicity of operation under stress. These priorities seemed almost pedestrian compared to the Mauser's engineering elegance, but they proved more valuable than precision most soldiers couldn't exploit. The SMLE represented a philosophy that effectiveness in the field trumped excellence on paper. Modern military small arms development has repeatedly relearned the Lee-Enfield's lessons. The M16 rifle's early failures in Vietnam came partly from tight tolerances, making the weapon jam in jungle conditions. The same problem plaguing the Mauser. In mud and sand, the solution involved loosening tolerances and adding chrome lining, essentially applying principles the SMLE had embodied since 1907. The AK-47's legendary reliability comes from generous clearances, letting it function when filled with dirt, exactly what made the Lee-Enfield work in trenches 70 years earlier. Contemporary military doctrine emphasizes volume of fire and rapid engagement, at shorter ranges rather than long-range, precision marksmanship, the same philosophy that led Britain to prioritize the mad minute over 1,000-yard accuracy. The rifle's story offers broader lessons about military, technology, and procurement. Advanced engineering doesn't automatically translate to battlefield superiority. The Mauser was objectively more sophisticated in design. Controlled feed, dual front locking lugs, superior metallurgy. But sophistication creates complexity, and complexity creates failure points. The Lee-Enfield succeeded through simplicity and forgiveness. Its loose tolerances, rear-locking bolt, and straightforward manual of arms made it easier to use and harder to break. Soldiers didn't need to be expert gunsmiths to keep it running. This matters because wars are fought by conscripts and reservists, not just career soldiers. A weapon that only performs excellently in expert hands is less valuable than one that performs adequately in anyone's hands. The economic lesson is equally relevant. Britain produced roughly 17 million Lee-Enfields across all variants from 1895 to the 1950s. The manufacturing process used simpler tooling and less precise machining than the Mauser required. This meant factories could be set up faster, workers trained more quickly, and production costs kept lower. During World War II, when industrial capacity determined how many rifles an army could field, the SMLE's manufacturability became strategic advantage. Germany produced excellent rifles, but never enough of them. Britain produced good enough rifles in sufficient quantity to arm not just its own forces, but provide weapons to resistance movements and allied nations. Across the globe, adequate weapons insufficient. Quantity beats superior weapons in limited numbers. The Lee-Enfield proved that old. Doesn't mean obsolete and modern doesn't guarantee better. It proved that understanding how soldiers actually fight matters more than theoretical performance. Most importantly, it proved the best weapon isn't the one that wins design competitions. It's the one that keeps working when everything else has failed. That soldiers trust with their lives, and that gets them home alive. The British Tommy's preference for his outdated rifle over German modern weapons wasn't stubbornness. It was wisdom earned through blood and mud and survival.